the evolution of the comic book store through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and today, and growing up a nerd next on Some Cereal for Dinner podcast.
You'll be down for something later tonight. You don't even know.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the podcast. I'm ENC. This is Some Cereal for Dinner. Glad you could be joining us today. This is an exciting episode. I got to interview the guy who owns the comic book store in the town in which I live. His name is David Roland. You'll be introduced to him shortly. But it was very interesting to hear his story and how he's been in the comic book fan for a long time, but how he's been in the industry for a long time and how he's seen that industry change over the years, going from holes in the wall to, popular geek culture and even kind of a cool thing to do. If there's one thing that's kind of, you could say about Generation X is we did produce a bunch of comic book nerds, and how he kind of grew up an introvert and a nerd, and how he went from nerd to comic book owner, comic book store owner, and that's a very interesting story you're going to hear on this episode. But before we do that, before we go to this episode, please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and share this on your favorite social media platform. It really means a lot to me. Hit that bell notification. It's a little small step for you to hit that subscriber button to share this, but you know what? It really means a lot to me. So if you could take the time to do that, I would much appreciate it. And if you want to go that one extra step further, you are always welcome to go to our Buy Me a Coffee page and donate some money. I'm actually working right now on getting a room in my house renovated so that I can actually have a studio here and do some, do it a little bit more professionally. I've actually picked up a little bit more professional equipment as well. And so every little bit helps. So if you want to go and donate to Buy Me a Coffee, I would super appreciate it. And it would really mean a lot to me. And now on to the program. Hi everyone. Welcome to Some Cereal for Dinner podcast. This is a special episode. I get to do an interview with David Roland, who's the guy who owns the comic book store in my town. And he has been in business here for how many years you've been doing comic books?
Been in business in St. George now for 13 years.
Okay.
I've been in business as a whole for 33 years.
Oh, wow.
So I moved here from Georgia, and the business originated there.
Okay.
And had 20 years prior store experience.
That is crazy. So today, obviously, the episode's going to be all about, because you're how old, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm 49.
49 years old. Doesn't look a day over 48. But no, actually, when I met him, I actually thought he was actually younger than me. And I was kind of wondering, well, because even though I don't mind interviewing people who are outside the Generation X category, I certainly thought you were, kind of that maybe Zennial kind of category, but you're actually a couple years older than me. I was surprised. So keep it up, whatever you're doing. So let's, I want to do a couple things here. I want to, talk about Generation X and the comic book store and comic books and that kind of stuff. But I kind of want to hear your story as well, like how you got into comic books. And we'll talk about all kinds of different ways that the industry has changed over the years. So tell us a little bit about how you were introduced to this. What age were you at? That kind of thing.
Well, like so many other people, I stumbled into comics when I was a young kid. My earliest memory, I think I was 8 or 9. I had my tonsils taken out.
Oh, no.
So I was in the hospital, waylaid for a few days recovery, and I had an aunt to come see me, and she brought a couple of comics up from the gift shop.
Okay.
And some of those books, I remember, one of them was a Marvel Star Wars from the 70s. and I read it, and it just kind of clicked with me.
Yeah.
My parents sadly were divorced when I was a very young age, so
Yeah.
I had the split family situation. And my dad would come pick me up every other weekend. I would visit my dad, and usually once a month during one of those trips, he would always take me to the barber shop. Very Hollywood moment, very cliche moment, but we would go into the barber shop, and there would be the 3 chairs. There's usually 2 barbers working, and one of them sitting down. The wall would be lined with these old men reading newspapers, sports magazines, talking politics, griping about whatever.
Yes.
So we would go in to get my hair cut. My dad would get his hair cut. He would always go first, and of course I would wait my turn. And there was a rack where these old men were all gathered together, and it had all kind of magazines on it, sports magazines, car magazines, and of course comic books.
Okay.
So I always loved it because I would, rifle through the books, looking at the different comic books. And he had all kinds. I was exposed very early on, probably about, at that point, 9 or 10 still. And I grew up on reading some of the Harvey comics, which were,
I'm not familiar with that at all. What's Harvey Comics?
Yeah, exactly. Wendy, and then Hot Stuff,
Okay.
all the other Harvey characters. They were fun to laugh at. But my personal favorite were the scary ones, the ghost comic books.
Okay.
He would have random, as far as I can remember, DC, mostly horror comics. House of Mystery, House of Secrets, Ghost. There would be Batman comics too I would read. But I was particularly drawn toward the scary ones because I loved the format of them.
Okay.
Being they were anthology, you could open one issue and you would have 3 short stories in it.
Okay.
So I could read the short stories and get to the end and have a conclusion and be satisfied before my turn was called to get my hair cut.
Okay.
There was nothing worse than reading a cliffhanger comic book and not getting to the end of it, and then I had to get my hair cut.
Yeah.
And I would come back a month later, but there was no guarantee that there would always be the next consecutive issue.
Right.
The barber would just go next door to the grocery store, and he would just buy random stuff off the racks.
Oh, I see.
So you never could request anything. But
so you mentioned you were about 9 or 10 around that time, or something like that.
Correct. Yeah.
And then when did you get into it as an industry? About how old were you when you got into it as an industry?
When I got into it as an industry, as what I tell people, I became a official comic book collector the summer of '83.
83.
Right. That's when, so between that 8, 9 era till the time I was 12. So it was about 4 years. I kind of floundered a little bit and just read issues here and there.
Okay.
But the summer of '83, I was at home, bored out of my mind. Mind you, this was '83, so no internet, no game systems, no cable TV, no satellite TV. You had to make your own entertainment back then.
Right, yeah.
And so, my mom would come home on her hour lunch break to check on me to make sure I was okay. And I was complaining, I was bored, and she's like, go ride your bicycle. This is in Georgia. That's where I grew up.
Yeah.
Okay, so in Georgia, in the middle of summer, in July, we're hitting 100 degrees.
Right.
With feels like 1,000% humidity, So it is super hot outside in Georgia. And I'm like, no, too hot to go ride the bike.
Right.
She was like, go explore the woods. We lived on a dead-end street next to some woods.
Okay.
And, we'd already been there for 6 years. There was nothing left to explore.
Okay.
So she kept coming up with all these things. Finally, she got tired of hearing me complain. And she said, here's $10. Don't tell your stepdad, but go down to the shopping center. There's a bookstore that just opened. She saw it next to the pharmacy. She went to the pharmacy. And she said, I saw comic books in the windows. Go buy you some comic books.
She knew you were into comics at that time.
She knew I enjoyed reading them.
Okay.
So she wanted me to have some form of entertainment. So that's what I did. I did brave the Georgia heat, got on the bicycle, rode down to the shopping center. It was about 2 miles from where we lived.
Okay. And what was the, during that era in '83, what was the community? Did you find a community quickly of other people
No.
who were also interested in comics?
This bookstore was just that, a bookstore.
Okay.
It was about maybe 80% books
Uh-huh.
and only 20% comic books.
Yeah.
They did carry new issues, and that's what I stumbled into. They had some back issues as well. And I remember the lady was nice enough to give me a little bit of guidance. But one book was on the wall that stood out that caught my eye, and little did I know it was such a key issue decades later.
Oh, okay. What was
But
it?
I picked up Thor 337.
Oh, okay.
So I bought it
I
brand new for 65 cents.
Wow. Do you
I
still
went
have
home
it?
and read that, and that was my first exposure to Walt Simonson.
Okay.
And I fell in love with the art style, the storytelling, and I was down there the next day looking for 338
Uh-huh.
to read more, and she had to explain to me, well, it doesn't come out for 3 more weeks.
Oh, I see.
So I was in an interim period.
I see.
So at that point, I started buying a few other books randomly. I
Okay.
bought some more Marvel, Star Wars, some Iron Man, some Batman. I gravitated toward the superheroes at first, like so many others. That's what I recognized.
Right. So let me ask you a question about this too, because there's a few directions I want to go with this as well. But one of the things I kind of want to talk about, because I'm a big fan of Star Wars myself, especially the original series. What was in 1983? We're just getting done with Return of the Jedi, right? And so what was Star Wars comic books at that time? What was it like? What were the stories about? Like, did it pick up like right where Empire, right where Jedi left off, or what happened?
The Star Wars issues I started kind of following regularly in that time period. We're near the very end of the Star Wars run.
Uh-huh.
It was after Return of the Jedi. They were original stories continuing the adventures of Luke and
Right.
Leia and Han. They were pretty bad stories.
Oh, they were. Yeah.
I just kind of bought them out of loyalty, and I was a sci-fi fan and
Yeah.
a geek.
Yeah.
But in 83, that was one of the things we struggled with, is you were saying, the community.
Yeah. Okay.
There was no way to find other comic book collectors. There was no way to find other nerds.
Yeah. Right.
And so I needed other, advice and information, but I couldn't find other people to connect with to say, what are you reading? What is good? What is bad?
Uh-huh.
So for me in 83, it was just picking up stuff randomly and testing the waters and seeing what I liked and what clicked with me.
Uh-huh.
83 was a different time period. Yeah. I tell my customers now all the time, nerd is the new black.
Yeah.
But,
You're in trouble for that. these
Any of
days.
us that are old enough have seen all the Revenge of the Nerd movies.
Yes.
That was my life.
Oh, okay.
You know,
All right.
I wasn't bullied to that extent by no means, but there was bullying happening in high school then.
Right. Yeah.
And I saw it constantly with other people that didn't fit in.
Right. I was
And-
bullied too. as a kid. Because I was
And-
I was a
yeah.
nerd. I mean, I was a geek, kind of into Star Wars, that kind of thing. I didn't really do the comic books a whole. I had a couple that were, I wish I still had it. Remember, I don't know if you remember this, but remember it was a comic book that basically went over the entire Empire Strikes Back. Do you remember that one?
Yeah. The Marvel Star Wars.
Yeah. It
Yeah,
was
they
a
did
comic
it.
book
If you
that
bought
went-
the individual issues, I think it took place over 3, but they did a collected book later. Exactly, you could buy the thick collected book and read the whole movie.
I had 2 of them and they're gone. I have no idea. I don't know if they're collector's items at this point or not, but yeah, I understand the getting bullied, because it was before. I mean, it's even before the modern era where you have television shows like Big Bang Theory, where it kind of exposed comic book. Comic book became kind of the new in thing to do as a result of some of those things, and also as a result of just movies getting better and being able to show the superheroes
Yes.
in a better light, and then people going, oh, okay, this is not just for people who are in their basement reading comic books because they don't, because they're not, athletic or something like that. And so it kind of got a little bit more exposure. But before that, so before we get to that, I want to know what your first experience was when you actually stepped foot into a comic book store. When did that happen for you?
That was, sadly, that bookstore, even though they introduced me to the world of comic books, was only around for about a year.
Okay.
So they went out of business. So I had no more connection to the comic industry directly,
Oh, no.
except for what I could find at the grocery stores or, a magazine rack at the gas stations or something. There was a comic book store in my town, but it might as well have been across the other side of the state.
Okay.
In the town I grew up in, it was a good-sized town, and it took about 25 to 30 minutes to get there because you had to drive across the center of town, hop on the interstate, do the traffic, get back off the interstate, and drive further outward. And trying to convince my parents to take me there was a nightmare. What do we get out of it? That was a 30-minute drive kind of thing. So they might take me to that store once to twice a year.
Was that just like Mecca for you, Nirvana?
It was
just
an eye-opening event and a Mecca at the same time.
Yeah.
It was a very traditional, what you think of comic book store back in the 80s.
Okay.
It was a dungeon, hole in the wall, half the lights burnt out. There was no central heat or AC. Box fans in the summer, opened the doors, and in the winter, a big kerosene heater in the middle of the floor, hoping people didn't pass out from the fumes.
Right.
And my mom, of course, she was doing her dutiful duties as a mother and wanted to protect her son.
Yeah.
So she went in the first time to see the store.
Right.
Wanted to know what I was into. She walked out and was thoroughly creeped out and said, "You've got 5 minutes. I'm outside in the car waiting."
Okay.
And so that put a time crunch on what I could see and do and buy,
Right.
But it was still fun to finally meet my people.
Yeah.
You know,
Did you feel a connection with them immediately?
it took a while because, as most nerds, we're introverts.
Yeah.
You know, being introverts, we're shy.
Uh-huh.
So it's hard for us to make connections with other people.
Okay.
You know, even if it is our own people.
Yeah.
It's still hard to broach some stranger and start, talking to them and making a
Saying,
connection.
what do you think about this issue of,
Yeah,
whatever.
it took a little time. Over time, I got to know the employees over the years, and I befriended some of them, and then it pulled me more out of my shell, of course. But it was still very different,
Okay.
Going back a little bit to the bullying thing, there were other nerds in my schools, but because of the bullying aspect, we were all closet nerds. We saw some of us, or some of them, I should say, more so, did not hide it, and so they were openly bullied. But by seeing that action, that made people like me, keep my nerdiness to myself.
Right.
I didn't tell people I was into Star Wars. My circle of friends at school, I didn't tell them I was into Dune and fantasy. I didn't tell them I loved Dark Crystal. I didn't tell them I liked all this stuff that was coming out of the theater.
Right.
Because I did not want to put a bullseye on my chest. I didn't want to be beat up. So when I found that comic book shop, it was a little nicer. I could then open up to my people, per se.
Yeah.
So it was wonderful to see more back issues, and it was definitely wonderful to see so many new and different issues.
So how did the comic book, so I'm sure you get into the comic book, you get into the comic book store, and then eventually you own a comic book store at some point. How did you go back? Did you say so this is like 83, 84, 85, somewhere around there. You're getting older, you're getting more into comics, although it might be sparse, might not be as consistent as you want it to be. And then you mentioned that at that time it was what everybody imagined. It was a hole in the wall and, dingy light. That was kind of comic book stores, the idea of comic book stores at that time. How long had that been going on? Like, how long had the comic book store, before it gets popular, existing, with the nerd community? How long had that been going on? Did you hear about people owning
for
comic
years,
book stores earlier?
This particular store in my town that was the second location, an actual storefront.
Okay.
I never had the luxury of visiting their first location, but their first location was actually an open booth at the local farmer's market.
Oh, okay.
That was their first official comic book store.
I see.
They were at a farmer's market, and they would set up every weekend and pull boxes out. And they started making enough money, they finally found an actual physical location, but they chose the cheapest rent in town to be able to do that. And of course, that was in one of the worst parts of town. You know, very isolated, very old. Like I said, the building was very dilapidated. I don't even know if the building is still there now after all these years.
Right. It might not be. Very well might not be.
But yeah, I got into it more and more as like you said, I got older. Once I became 16, well, I got my license a little later. I got my license when I was almost 17. But I had an older stepbrother that was a year older.
Okay.
So really, once he turned 16, I had more access to the store.
Okay.
I could pay him gas money and convince him to take me there.
Right, okay.
So I started frequenting the store more and started staying more up on the books and the industry and not missing as many issues or having as many holes in my run.
Right.
And then once I was 17 or got my license, I got my car, so then I could start driving myself more to the store.
Cool. So tell me about some of at that time, did they have the whole Marvel versus DC, your kind of thing, ours is better than yours, or?
It was a little bit of rivalry. I mean, you had a few crossovers in the 70s and 80s. People seen the giant treasury edition of Superman, Spider-Man, you know. So you had some of that rivalry a little bit with the crossover books. But no, in my town, we had our favorites.
Okay.
I was a little bit more of a Marvel fan, but that switched in 85 for me. I like Marvel just because that's kind of what I went for first.
Okay.
But I tried to read, DC stuff, and it just never hooked me as much.
Okay.
But
you said that switched in 85. What happened in 85?
In high school, one of my fondest memories, we were in the proverbial study hall, and I did not realize I found another closet nerd.
Okay.
And he was like one row over, about 2 desks up.
Okay.
So, of course, we're supposed to be opening our books and studying, whatever classes or whatever. But he had his book open, and inside of it was another Hollywood moment, a comic book inside the actual science book. So he, holding a science book up where the teacher can see it, but he's reading a comic book. And me, with my trained eyes, spot that right away.
Yeah.
So, I whisper his name, and I'm like, "What are you reading?" And he closes it so I could see it, and it was Judge Dredd.
Oh, okay. All right.
Never heard of Judge Dredd. Never seen it before. So after study hall was over with, we go outside in the hallway, and I start talking to him. I'm like, "You're a comic book fan?" He goes, "I read a little bit." And I said, "This is great." Because he was the one and only other person I found in my whole school.
Right.
So it's like, yay, there's 2 of us in school that know comic books that read them.
Yeah.
And he's like, "Hey, I've got like the first 8 issues. Do you want to borrow them?" I said, "Sure, I'd love to borrow them."
Uh-huh.
So he brought them to school, and I read Judge Dredd, and this came out, I want to say around 83, 84, so it'd been out for a few years. And he let me read them and catch up on them, and that was my first exposure to indies.
Okay.
And so I read Judge Dredd, and this was some great early stuff from this was put out by a company called Eagle Comics in the 80s in America, but they were really reprinting the 2000 AD stuff in the UK.
Okay.
So they were reprinting it and making it trim size. The UK stuff was magazine size.
Okay. So
So they condensed it down to American size comic books so that it would reach a better audience. So I didn't know about all that till later, but I read them. I read the Judge Dredd, and I fell in love. And, not only did I fall in love with the storytelling, but I fell in love with the artist. And a big artist of that time, and people know their Eagle Comics and Judge Dredd history, Brian Boland. Later on, goes along to do The Killing Joke, one of the greatest Batman stories ever. So I got some early exposure to him before he became a big American household name with his Killing Joke.
Okay.
And I fell in love with him because Judge Dredd killed people. It was my first exposure to a darker title.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, it just blew my mind.
Right.
Plus, I was always a sci-fi fan.
Yeah.
I loved Star Trek, I grew up in that age where Star Trek Next Generation started.
I did too, as a matter of fact.
I mean, we talked about it, I think,
Fox.
for a year
Fox
or so
just
before it
came
ever
out
came
as a-
on TV. We were so pumped, we were counting it down. Buck Rogers, if you remember that, was on TV.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I love Buck Rogers. One that predates you. Greatest American Hero.
Oh, yeah.
Battlestar Galactica, 1980.
No, it doesn't predate me.
Yeah.
Greatest American Hero. I'm not
Okay.
old. I was there when that came out.
So, I mean, that was all the sci-fi we had at the time. We didn't have a lot like there is now. It wasn't as mainstream. So for, TV stations, networks, or movies, Hollywood, whatever, to take a gamble on something like that was huge for us.
Right.
And it was fun times. It was fun times.
So tell me a little bit about one of the things I want to talk about is and I want to move forward in your story to get to where you're owning a comic book store, where you're working at a comic book store that you own. But before that, I kind of want to talk about the industry during that time and some of the comics that came out. Tell me what you think is one of those comics that like everybody kind of knows about it now, but like nobody knew about it in the 80s. Could you think of maybe a handful of comics that people like, oh, well, that's cool, and maybe just a very few people knew about? I'm thinking like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
That's the one that came to my mind.
Yeah.
I remember going into the local comic book store, and I found a third guy at my high school that was into comic books, and we became friends. And turned out we visited the same store, so we started going there together sometimes. And like I said, I transitioned into the indies title, so I was looking for new indies to read.
Yeah.
And he was reading me, he's like, hey, check out this book, and he holds it up. And immediately I'm turned off because of the size of it.
Right.
Magazine size. And I'm like, that's not a comic book, that's a magazine. I'm looking at it like, what is this? He's like, this looks great. It's got these 4 Ninja Turtles on here. And, they're like fighting and martial arts and kicking butt. You should buy this. And I laughed and said, that looks stupid. Talking turtles. Who wants to read that?
Right. Everybody.
So, I had it in my hand, number 1, first print, and I
really?
passed on it.
First print and passed on it.
I passed on it. So that's one of those, whoops moments in life that you never would know about.
We all got them. So tell me, what is a comic book series that was maybe popular in the community at that time, but never really got popular, and it should have been? Like one of those underground comics that you thought was just gold, and you're going, how come everybody's not reading this?
Believe it or not, another indie titles I was exposed to, there was a combo company in the 80s called Viz, V-I-Z.
Okay.
And they started doing a lot of early manga comic books.
Oh, okay.
Okay, but we didn't have the word manga in our culture back then.
Yeah.
It didn't exist. We didn't have the word anime in our culture either. Back then we called it just Japanese comics or Japanimation.
Japanimation, that's a good name.
We would see Japanimation. We were about 30 miles from an Air Force base. So sometimes local airmen would come back from overseas and they would have Laserdisc. And one of my first exposures was the movie Akira.
Not familiar with it.
Great classic. Need to check that one out. And anyway, an airman brought Akira back, and it was Laserdisc. If people are familiar with their size, they're huge.
Yeah.
Okay. Akira is an over a 2-hour-long movie.
Okay.
So the Laserdisc could only hold about 40 minutes on each side. So we all gathered around at the local comic book store. He hooked up the Laserdisc player to the TV, small TV. There's about 30 of us. He invited us all in to come watch it one Saturday. So we're all looking over each other's shoulder, jonesing for the best position to see what this was about. And this was, I don't know, I think 88, maybe when we saw it in the store, 87, somewhere in that area. And so we watch 40 minutes, it stops. You have to pull the disc out, flip it over to side 2, reload, play it. It stops, pull disc 1 out, go to disc 2, and do the same thing.
Right.
But we loved it. And the other crazy thing about Akira, if anybody's ever seen it, it's a very complicated movie to begin with, plot-wise. But this movie was straight Japanese.
Okay.
no subtitles whatsoever.
Oh.
No subtitles, no English stuff, no nothing. So we didn't know what we were watching.
You didn't know what the heck was going
Our
on.
minds were blown
Yeah.
because it was the coolest animation we had ever seen.
Right.
So that right there, the bug bit me for the manga stuff.
Okay.
So I started buying Viz comics. And I started about the Akira comic book that Marvel published back in the day. A lot of people forget about them. But they published the original Akira comic here in the U.S. I bought all the Marvel comics when they did it. And then I started buying a lot more Viz product about the classic Appleseed. All the fans are going to know Appleseed. That's a great classic. Masamune Shiro, very popular with Ghost in the Shell series. Anyway, but also bought an underground book that no one ever knew about, Nausicaa, Hayao Miyazaki. They published his Nausicaa series in a monthly comic book format, not the thick manga that we have now, but you could buy it in a monthly comic book format. And I loved these books. They were incredible with the art style and the storytelling. But yeah, nobody was buying them. So it was kind of fun to be into something that people weren't into.
Yeah.
You know. So
it made it
easier to find the issues. You know, I didn't have as much competition.
Okay.
So I made it easy. It made it easy to find back issues when I missed something. But yeah, I fell in love with all of that stuff. I got into Gundams. I started buying Gundam model kits way back in '87.
Okay.
A lot of people didn't know what it was, but it wasn't until the '90s when, you know, I think about '91, '92 or so, when Cartoon Network had the whole Toonami on Cartoon Network, and they brought over Japanese animation to start airing in the U.S. So we saw Sailor Moon, we saw Gundam, we saw Dragon Ball Z.
Was like Voltron? Was that Japanese?
That is a Japanese show.
Okay, so I remember
that was early '80s when it came out.
I remember Voltron as a kid. I remember Voltron. I really liked Voltron. And then there's Nickelodeon had one with a kid.
Mysterious Cities of Gold.
Well, it was a dog.
Oh, okay, I'm thinking of a different one. Okay.
It was a dog, and this was in the '80s, you know, like mid '80s, like '85 or whatever, when Nickelodeon was kind of coming out and, you know, searching for programs, but I could clearly tell it was Japanese. And then Battle of the Planets.
Yeah, G-Force or Battle of the Planets, another big one, exactly right.
Now,
did
that ever have a comic book series, Battle of the Planets, or no? Or is this cartoon?
As far as I know, I mean, there's been some more modern stuff they've done in comic book format. But yeah, for the original stuff, as far as I know, back in the 70s when they did it, I don't think it was a manga or a serial show or anything. It was just an anime.
An anime, yeah. That was one of my absolute favorite shows that I watched back in the day.
Tiny, I always loved Tiny on there, you know. So yeah, exactly. That was all Japanese based. And like I said, I felt like I was ahead of the game, and I loved it, and it was great. But then that 92 period, that's when it exploded and finally became a household name.
92.
Yeah, somewhere area, 91, 92. I don't remember exactly.
Well, yeah. That's the time when a lot of underground. Nirvana came out at that time as an underground band, and maybe that coincide with underground people who kind of listen to that kind of music and then come, you know, I don't know. But so let's move forward on the timeline with you. You said you were working in a comic book store.
Yeah, when I was 17, right. When I was 17, a second store opened in my town.
Oh, okay.
So this was phenomenal.
Okay.
The second store was, when they first opened, they were all baseball cards.
Okay.
That was all they did. They did baseball cards and related merchandise. Eventually, the owner decided he wanted to branch out, and so he bought a large comic book collection. He had about, 30, 40 long boxes of comics. My brother happened to know the owner.
Okay.
And so my brother mentioned it in passing, going, hey, you know, my younger brother's a big comic book fan. He could come help you out. So he gave me the information, so I went to go see the new store. And I wanted to check out the new stuff because I'm looking to fill holes. I wanted to be one of the first to dig through these collections. And so I went to go see him, and I offered my expertise. I said, I'll be happy to help you sort these comic books. You know, he knew nothing about them.
Okay.
And I said I could help alphabetize, group them, price them, help you make money. And all I did in return, I told him, I said, I already have a couple of jobs. I said, I don't need money. I said, we'll just barter. let me work for store credit. He said, sold, you know. So I worked for store credit for him from 87.
You were a slave. You worked working for peanuts.
I worked for him from
That's
87
cool, though.
to about 1990.
Okay.
For 3 years.
Uh-huh.
And I built up the industry, that side of the business so much. Toward the last part of my employment in 90, that's when I started going to college.
Okay.
And the fall of 89, I went to college, and it became very stressful time. I was working 3 jobs, technically, 2 paying jobs and a comic book store.
Oh, no.
And going to school full time.
Ugh.
So I had to cut
I
something.
couldn't imagine.
Something finally had to be cut. So I went to them and was going to tender my resignation to quit, as much as it pained me.
Right.
But they realized they had a valuable resource, and they had seen so much of their revenue go up because of me. So they made sacrifices and said, we want to put you on the books.
Okay.
So I started working for pay then. You know, I still got a little barter on the side as gravy, but they made me an official and paid employee, so then I could quit one of the other jobs.
Cool.
And I worked for them for about a year, and then sadly, circumstances just arose. They wanted to shut down the business. But I put blood, sweat, and tears into it for 3 years and really grown that side of the industry for them. And I saw a lot of professional mistakes they were making. I know that sounds arrogant coming from, you know, an 18-year-old kid, 19-year-old kid at that time. But I saw a lot of mistakes they were making. And so they wanted to close the business and basically just default on the bank payment. They were going to walk away and let the bank repossess the store.
Oh, no.
And so once I learned of their plans, I cut them off at the pass, and I went to the bank and told the bank what was happening.
Okay.
And of course, the bank was like, no, you know, we don't want to them to default. We don't want to lose on the payments,
Right.
You know. And so basically at that point, I realized, you know, I was 18, 19. All I had was $500 credit to my whole history, my name. I was never going to be able to pay off that bank note. So I went to the bank of parents.
Okay.
And, you know, I laid out a business plan. Didn't know what it was called at the time. I just laid out a plan with my parents, you know, on what kind of revenue we were bringing in, what was really happening. Could they finance me? And they did.
Oh, cool.
So my parents took out the money from another bank.
Really cool.
To pay the first one off.
Okay.
So once I paid the first bank note off, and they were ready to be done with it, so I actually got it pennies on the dollar. So they were like, we want to be done. We're willing to negotiate a good price. Just pay it off, you know.
Awesome.
So all the business became mine.
Awesome. That's
And
really
so I
cool.
changed the name of it to kind of start afresh. And that was the Christmas of 1990. I told people that was my Christmas present to myself. So in 91, I think it was January of 91 is when Comics Plus was actually formed.
Okay.
Before that, we were Ballpark Novelties.
Okay.
And so Comics Plus became into being in 91, but the business had been operational since 87.
Oh, interesting.
So, but I owned it then, opened it up the 1st of 91, and it's been mine ever since.
So tell me then a little bit about, so now we're in the 90s, and what was the explosion where it kind of became a little bit more popular happen in 91, 92?
Yes. That's when we started seeing comic books become more mainstream.
Okay. Now, did you like that or did you not like that?
No, it was, as a business owner now, I liked it.
Yeah. You can be idealistic if you don't have any business, right?
Right. But as a fanboy, no. You know, because my world, you know, kind of coming back to the whole anime thing.
Right.
My fun world was now being exposed to the public. And so, you know, like I said, in 92, with the whole Japanese stuff now exploding, everybody wanted to be into Gundams. But I'd already been into Gundams for about 5 years prior to that.
Yeah.
So that was my fun little niche, my little circle. No one knew what Gundams were. I knew what they were.
Right,
you know?
right.
But like I said, as a businessman, I needed the moolah. You know, I needed the money. I had to pay off the bank note. But yeah, shortly after I got the store, that was when we started seeing some huge trends in the market. Spider-Man #1 came out. Todd McFarlane set all kind of records. I don't remember what, 3 million, 4 million, something like that printed. Then you had the death of Superman. You know, that was a major changing point in the comic industry.
What about the death of Robin? Remember that one with
Yeah,
Jason?
that was earlier. That was back in the 80s still.
Okay,
yeah.
all right.
That never quite went mainstream.
Okay.
That was more fanboys, the nerds that voted on that. But these others were making newspaper articles.
Okay.
That's what brought in the general public. The news industry was finally getting wind of some of these record-breaking sales. So they started doing articles on them, talking about Spider-Man #1 and talking about the death of Superman. And so that brought in the general populace. People that had never purchased comics at all wanted to come in and read these for the first time or invest in them, hoping they were going to make millions of dollars, but that didn't pan out.
yeah. Didn't pan out at that time. Now, did the superhero movie... Now, well, let me back up. I know that by 91, you started getting more... By 90, at least the mid-90s, you started getting more factions, more people being like, well, I'm pro Marvel, and other people, well, no, I'm more pro. Did that started to arise? Did you see a rise in that
definitely became more obvious. Before, it was more of a tongue-in-cheek kind of rivalry kind of thing with the fans.
Yeah.
Hey, your Batman stinks. Oh, yeah, your Spider-Man stinks. It was all done in tongue-in-cheek, elbows, wink, wink.
Yeah.
But, also in the early 90s, that's when we saw, other big things happening in the industry. McFarlane left Spider-Man after so many issues. He felt like he wasn't getting the respect, the pay, the control enough of a book that set records. So he went and launched the formation of a new company, Image Comics.
Okay.
So that, I think, when we saw the beginning of the Image, we saw more of that kind of, not bitter rivalry, but fandom rivalry. Where fans were definitely, I'm pro DC, I'm pro Marvel, or now I'm pro Image.
What did Image produce? Which comics came from them?
Their biggest one was Spawn.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, still running now. Spawn just broke a record about a year ago, 300. I don't know what it's up to now, 310 or something. But at issue 301, it set a new independent record for the longest running independent comic book.
Oh, really?
Prior to that, the record was held by Cerebus, Dave Sims. His issues ran from the 70s all the way to 300, and he ended the book. But now McFarlane has passed that. But they also launched a lot of other books. We saw the beginning of Wildcats, Savage Dragon, that's still going. A lot of the other books didn't last the test of time. They lost their fans, or the stories got weak. Anyway, publication dropped. So they ended a bunch of the other titles. We saw Young Blood, that ended. Wildcats eventually ended. A bunch of the other original Image titles. I think the only two that are still in print now are just Savage Dragon and Spawn. But Image is a very successful company by today's standards, because they changed formats about 10 years ago, actually longer than that now. Losing track of time.
That's how it gets when you get older.
Yeah, it does. When they launched Walking Dead, that's when they finally started, as a company, started kind of thinking outside the box. Prior to that, a lot of their previous titles were more superhero focused.
Okay, all right.
Which stands to reason, because all the original founders, most of them came from Marvel drawing superhero comics. So that was what they knew. But in comes Robert Kirkman with a whole new idea. Let me draw a zombie comic book. And they're like, why not? Let's do it. Let's see what happens.
Why not?
Go ahead. And so they decided to give it a shot. And it was a huge success for them.
Cool.
And after launching Walking Dead, they realized, why are we just painting ourselves in a corner? And they were like, if you've got an original idea, bring it to us. We're Image. We'll publish it.
Yeah.
And so the company really diversified and got away from just being superhero focused. So you can get all kind of genre now from Image. You get Western, horror, sci-fi, still superhero. Crime noir, you name it, they make it. And that's what I like about Image as a company, is their library is incredible. Any fan can find something from them to read now.
What? So what was the peak? Was there a peak, or are you still riding high on it even now?
No, this industry definitely had its highs and lows. We had a big peak in the mid '90s.
Okay.
Early to mid '90s, definitely. Like I said, going back to Spider-Man #1, X-Men #1, X-Force #1, all those big hits from Marvel were at the very top of the peak. After that, there was a confluence of events that kind of crashed the market.
Okay.
We had the baseball strike.
Okay.
In the '90s, the baseball players quit playing for a season, so the baseball card industry took a dive.
Okay.
That made fans mad.
And was that part and parcel of comic books?
Yes, because I had crossover customers.
Oh, okay.
Customers that would collect both cards and comics.
Ah, interesting. I didn't know that.
So once they got mad at the players, they were mad at the players for walking off the fields per se, and so they took it out on the industry by not buying any more baseball cards.
Ah.
And so it's like you're not punishing the players that way. You're punishing, the mom and pop stores.
Right.
And so we suffered tremendously. In my town, by that time, I think about '93, we had 7 comic and card stores. So in a matter of like 3 years, we went from 2 to 7.
Oh, wow.
The industry was growing so fast. But the baseball strike hit, and the comic book industry felt it indirectly, like I said, because they were crossover collectors. So they all quit at once. So we went from 7 to 2 in a year.
Okay.
I was one of the 2,
Okay.
so we rode it out.
You're one of those ships that weathered the storm.
I did, yeah. I weathered the storm because even at that time period, I was still ahead of the game. My saving grace for my store back then was I added so much more new product.
Okay.
The other stores were either all cards, all comics, or a little bit of both.
Okay.
I did both, but I also added games, I added anime. I had a big collection of Gundams at the time,
Right.
So that stuff exploded. I added toys. I started going crazy in the early '90s, buying up old G.I. Joe and Star Wars and He-Man and Thundercats and Silverhawks. All the generational toys I grew up on.
Right.
I saw value in them.
Wow.
And so Ghostbusters, Mask, you name it, I was buying them. So when that crash hit in the mid-'90s, we felt it both in comics and baseball cards. That part of the business dropped tremendously. I was doing okay because I had all the other product.
Get other retro kind of cool stuff.
Right,
maybe,
exactly.
Maybe not at that time it was retro, but maybe a little bit
But
verging on
Transformers. I had so much Generation 1 Transformers. It was incredible.
I had a few of those myself.
People would just come in to look at my toy collection. Word got around town, you got to go to this shop and see all the old toys you played with 10 years ago. Right. And people were walking in, and I just had shelves and shelves full of old toys.
Yeah.
And it was so easy to buy them back then. They were everywhere.
So do you think that one of the main differences between the '80s, the hole in the wall, and then what you have today is not just the more fluctuation of business, but the fluctuation of business coming in gives you the liberty to have a nice store?
Well, one of the things that I put in the back of my mind a long time ago, I never set out to plan to own my own store.
Okay.
It just happened.
Right.
And so when circumstances finally arose, and it's like, wow, the shock wore off, I actually have my own key. This is my business. The first thing I remembered was my mom. Remember her going to that comic book store and being so creeped out.
Yeah.
She felt very uncomfortable by it.
Right.
These guys weren't doing anything, bad or anything like that. It just, it was dark, it was damp, musty, dirty.
Sure.
She just didn't like to go in a store like that.
Yeah.
So I remembered that right away. So that's one of the first things I did was I made sure the store was clean, organized, well lit. So I always took care of that. And so that was a good selling point for me in the early '90s when I got the store.
Right.
My store was so different from all the other traditional comic book stores. And that helped me get ahead of the game too, because then I started seeing moms.
Right, right.
Moms wanted to come in and visit my store, and they didn't mind staying. And the more they stayed, the more their sons spent.
Yeah.
And
Right.
so I saw the benefit of that.
Uh-huh.
And so I continued that plan. And I've been doing that for 30 years.
That's one of the benefits of being able to have an extra, have the income go up and stuff for people. Is there anything from that era that's not around anymore that you kind of wish was still around? Or
I have a lot of nostalgia for a lot of the indie comic books.
okay,
I hated that there was a lot of good titles that just didn't last.
yeah,
Like I mentioned earlier, talking about Judge Dredd, Eagle Comics eventually folded. They were doing a lot of UK product over here. It opened our eyes. It gave us new titles to read and enjoy, but they're gone.
Okay.
And there were so many other comic book companies like that. Innovation Comics, there were so many others, Eclipse Comics, Viz Comics. Viz is still around. They had the shift to stay alive. They stopped doing the monthly comics and started doing the thick manga.
okay,
But it's a different time. It was, everybody has a nostalgia moment for their childhood kind of thing.
yeah.
But yeah, there were so many titles, and I hate that they've been lost to time now.
Yeah.
I'm always talking about the good old days, so to speak, and I'm always talking to customers, trying to introduce them to stuff. I've been here in St. George for 13 years, and I'm a strong indie fan, so I've been pushing my indies for a while.
Uh-huh.
And, I've been pushing people onto Preacher and Sandman, and I was talking up Watchmen before we ever had the movie.
Yeah.
But
Right.
it's taking those moments for the public to kind of jump on board with them a little bit. But they all saw the Watchmen movie, and then they came in and finally said, "I want to read the comic book." I'm glad you're here. I'm finally glad you're saying yes to this. But I've been talking about it for years.
Right. That probably didn't happen with the Fantastic Four, though, did it?
No, I didn't. Yeah.
That was one of the worst. Both emanations of it too. Were probably some of the worst movies.
Yeah, there've been some stinker movies, but I've seen all of these movies.
Oh yeah. Me
Every
too.
single movie that comes out that's comic book based, I throw my support at.
Yeah.
And one pet peeve I have is so different from my generation, the Generation X, to this modern generation now. I don't know what are the modern generation
So
now.
there's Zennials, which is kind of 1 foot in Generation X and one foot in Millennial.
Right.
And they're kind of defined between 79 to 84. And then 84 to like 2003 or something like that, I can't remember exactly, are millennials. And then these kids that are coming up that are turning 18 now, they call them Generation Z.
Yeah, that's
And
what I thought I heard. Generation Z.
Generation Z. So millennials are the young parents today,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. But they're even getting older. But I remember the gap between a Generation X and a millennial was
Right, generation. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But so you're
And,
probably getting Zennial, or not Zennials, but Generation Z coming in.
Yeah. And so this newer generation of kids, everybody's an internet warrior.
Yes.
And so as soon as a movie comes out, they hop right on the internet and start picking everything apart that was
Right.
absolutely wrong with the movie. Whereas I go to the movie and I'm like, I loved it. It was a bad story, but I still loved it.
I get that. I get that too. Especially if you grew up, with watching the Hulk on TV.
Yes.
To see
Exactly.
anything that looks
That terrible Swamp Thing movie we had, or
Yeah.
better yet, not many kids today know about that Captain America movie.
Oh yeah.
They riding around on the dirt bike,
Yeah.
and he had that terrible helmet on, terrible costume.
Yeah.
But we loved it as nerds because that was the only thing we had.
Right.
We knew it was terrible.
way better than what we were getting earlier. We
were getting nothing before then,
Yeah.
so we loved it. But, all the movies, you can nitpick every movie that comes out and find something wrong with it. But
Right.
like I said, that's just my pet peeve now is how much they nitpick these new movies, everything that's wrong with it. It's like, wow, you've never seen a bad one. Go back and watch our stuff. It was bad.
yeah, exactly. Well, David, we're just about out of time, and you came in an hour early just to accommodate me. I really appreciate that. And is there any final words? I want to, give you your time to open up your store here and stuff like that. Maybe if there's a little extra time, you can show me maybe some of your, your prize collections from the era. But and I'll make that a video exclusive for the YouTube channel. This actually goes out on both podcast and video form, and then I have video exclusives on my YouTube channel. But is there any final things you want to know? How can people get a hold of you? As far as, do you have an online presence or?
I'm slowly working on that. We do have a website, www.comicsplus.com.
Okay.
We tore it down about a year or two back. I've been real slack with rebuilding it.
Okay.
Right now, people go to it. It's just going to point to our Facebook page.
Okay.
So you can go to the website, and then you can reach me through that, or you can go to the Facebook page.
Facebook page. Give them a like on Facebook for sure.
Yeah, facebook.com/comicsplus.
Okay.
Sadly, with the whole COVID crisis and the pandemic, everything we've been experiencing, I'm feeling the numbers crunch too. So things have pushed my financial plans backwards a little bit to try to build the website, but we're getting there.
Yeah.
You know, I'm slowly working on it. But yeah, fans can do that. Of course, you can look me up on good old-fashioned Google, you know, St. George, Utah, you know, just Google that. It'll have my number, everything else there. They can reach me that way too.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. One suggestion: more board games.
Yeah.
We got to get more board games because I have to go to the other store. I'd rather come here. I really would.
I appreciate that. I do appreciate you supporting the local guys rather than the chain store.
For sure.
You know,
but
like
you got to go where where it's available too. If you have more available
and,
here.
you know, that's the
those
ball I
communities,
dropped.
those communities kind of run together, don't they? Board game communities and comic book store kind of communities.
Yeah, we've always had games in one form or format. You know, I've kind of dropped the ball a little bit on let it settle down a little bit over the past couple of years.
Right.
Just because it became a little harder to compete with.
Yeah.
You know, you got the rise of the big box stores that are now carrying games.
Yes.
My store used to be the only place in town you could buy Munchkin, but not anymore.
Right.
You know, you can find it at a lot of the mainstream big box stores, bookstores included, or whatever.
Yeah.
So I feel like the game community around here has kind of been saturated a little bit, and it's hard for me to sell other things like that now.
Yeah, that might be the case. I could totally understand that. But any final thoughts or anything like that?
Support your local owned comic book store. We are dinosaurs.
Yes.
You know, there's no doubt about it. They're drying up. More people of this modern generation are definitely point and click on their phone or point and click on their computer or whatever and buying things. But you lose a lot. You know, that's what people don't understand, what you lose by doing that. There's so much anonymity, but you don't connect. You don't connect to your fellow fans. You don't connect to your fellow nerds.
Right.
And you don't get the knowledge that they have.
Yeah.
You know, like I said, great stories, you know, like I was talking about a little while ago about the indies, you know. Now people are jumping on board with Sandman, you know, because it's coming out with a series.
Right.
But I've been talking about Sandman for years. For years. You know, it's like Neil Gaiman's award-winning series. Everybody's becoming a Neil Gaiman fan now with the success of Good Omens, you know, great TV show. They're learning his name as a household name, his American Gods on the Stars. Everybody's now knowing who Neil Gaiman is. That's fantastic. But if you'd come into here years ago, you would have known about him before then, you know, because I would have told you all about him, support Neil Gaiman kind of thing.
Right.
So there's an advantage to going to your local comic book store. You know, like I said, you get the connection, you get the history that you normally would not have, you know, because the internet doesn't talk about old stories. The internet doesn't talk about old characters.
Yeah, right.
You have to know what you're researching and looking for to find that information now.
For sure. All right, well, thank you very much, David. Really appreciate it. Hey, if you like what we're doing here, there's a few ways you can support the channel. You can always like, comment, subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube. If you're listening to this on podcast form, please leave me a review, an honest review, give me a rating. And then it doesn't matter if you're listening to this on YouTube or if you're listening to this on podcast, share it on your favorite social media, get the word out about this program. Would really, really, really mean a lot to me. And if you want to go that one extra step, we do have a donation page called Buy Me a Coffee, and the link will be in the description below. And until then, I'm Ian C, and this is my friend David, and we'll probably do one of these again. There's so much to talk about, and you're always welcome to come on the show. Anytime you want to talk about something or promote something, you're more than welcome. And we'll see you again on the next episode of Some Cereal for Dinner podcast. Hey everyone, I just wanted to thank you once again for tuning into this episode of Some Cereal for Dinner podcast. And just a quick reminder for all you who are listening to it on the podcast format, we also have a video page over on YouTube, which does have some video exclusives. So head on over there if you're interested. And if you're already on YouTube and you liked this video, well, you might like these videos as well.